Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So in case you went to bed before the federal election was called last night, this morning we do have a clear winner. After triggering a snap election with the goal of getting a majority, the Liberals have come up short, managing to only get a minority. But Justin Trudeau will remain as Canada's Prime Minister. This win was by no means a given. The Conservatives and Liberals have been neck and neck in the polls for weeks, so we're going to talk about how they ultimately pulled off this victory and what this means for Justin Trudeau and for the country.
The moment we face demands real, important change. And you have given this Parliament and this government clear direction.
In the early hours of Tuesday morning, I talked to the Globe's writer-at-large, John Ibbitson, who was at the Conservatives' election party in Oshawa, and parliamentary reporter Kristy Kirkup, who called in from the Liberal celebration in Montreal. You're listening to The Decibel. Kristy, John, hello. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. So, Kristy, we're talking at 11:45 p.m. on election night. The Liberals have failed to get a majority, but they have won, and they will have a minority government. And you're at their victory party, so how are things going over there? What's the mood like?
Yeah, I would say under normal circumstances, we would have a bit more of a read on what the mood is like. But at Liberal Party headquarters in Montreal, essentially it's just a bunch of journalists in a room right now, and there aren't any supporters or Liberals really in the room because of COVID-19 restrictions. That being said, I think for the Liberals, of course, there's a bit of a sigh of relief going on because, of course, I think there was concern throughout the campaign about, whether the Conservatives might be able to form government. The polls indicated that they were in a neck-and-neck race. So, breathing a sigh of relief that they have won, but again, not the majority that the Liberals were looking for. And frankly, I think why Justin Trudeau decided to trigger this exercise in the first place, even though he did not explicitly tell Canadians that was the reason. He never uttered the word majority. He just said he would like to see Liberals take the most number of seats in the House of Commons.
Right. And I know you're waiting to hear him speak, so we'll try and wrap this up in time for you to be able to do that. But John, you're in Oshawa where the Conservatives were hoping to celebrate a victory tonight. How are things going over there?
They're even more sepulchral than they are in the Liberal camp. Again, just as Kristy said, there's really no one in the hall except media. The Conservative strategists who were talking confidently earlier in the evening have mysteriously vanished. There will be supporters brought in to cheer Mr. O'Toole when he comes in to speak. But it is going to be a bittersweet address because, yes, he was able to limit the Liberals to a minority government. I think at the beginning of the campaign, he would have been very happy with that result. But as you know, the Conservatives really surged ahead in the early part of the election campaign, and it looked as though indeed they might seriously dent the Liberal plurality or even possibly form a minority government themselves. But that was not to be.
And Kristy, I wonder, the polls were showing a very tight race, like John said, but if we look at the seat count right now, it's not really tight at all. And so how are we supposed to understand these results based on the polls that we were seeing?
Well, perhaps this election is going to go down as the Groundhog Day election. And frankly, I think that there is a sentiment among a large number of Canadians, this election didn't need to happen in the first place. And yet, here we are.
Mm-hmm. And John, any thoughts you want to add on how do we reconcile what we were seeing in the polls versus the results that we're seeing tonight?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. Pollsters will tell you, especially in this election, they can accurately poll the mood of an electorate. It's much harder to know exactly who will turn out to vote and who those voters will be. And indeed, for example, we saw that the NDP was surging ahead, that they would be making really significant gains at the Liberals' expense, but not so much as it turned out on election night. Now, part of that was no doubt a success of Justin Trudeau in convincing NDP voters that they had to rally to the Liberal cause in order to prevent a Conservative government. Part of it must have been as well NDP voters not showing up at the polls as expected. Of course, in some communities, there were very long lines to vote, so you really had to be determined in order to do it. And I think at the end of the day, again, it was, if not a Groundhog Day election, maybe even a Seinfeld election, an election about nothing.
And John, earlier today, a spokesperson for the O'Toole campaign told the Toronto Star that if they managed to hold the Liberals to a minority, they'd consider it a victory. And I wonder what you make of that. Why did they say that?
Well, I think they shouldn't have said that. That was a terrible thing to say on Election Day when you're trying to rally your supporters to get out the vote. It was a mistake to say it. But in the broader context, that is how the Conservatives are going to pitch this. And to some extent, they're right. Justin Trudeau wanted a majority government. He didn't get it. Aaron O'Toole, before the election campaign, appeared to be headed for a very poor election result. But he rallied the base, got the party back to about where it was 2 years ago. He didn't grow his vote, and that would be very frustrating for him because he really moved the party towards the center in an effort to try to get suburban immigrant middle-class voters, especially the ones who decide election campaigns in the Greater Toronto area, to come over to the party, and they didn't. But the result in July was looking much more grim than it is tonight, and they will declare that a moral victory.
Right. I wonder, though, what does this mean for how the Liberals govern moving forward? Does the fact that they've only been able to get a minority diminish their negotiating power in Parliament?
I think, in the last parliament, we did see cooperation on legislation. And what, of course, comes to mind are, the different aid packages that the government was rolling out during the pandemic. And they did have to work with other parties. And the NDP tried to point it at different successes they had in terms of getting the government to move forward with enriched supports for Canadians during a very difficult time. And so I think that what they will try to say, the Liberals will try to say, is that they will work in cooperation with other parties. I think, though, there was a remark that the Prime Minister made prior to this election about, kind of the toxicity in Parliament and not being able to cooperate with other parties, and almost suggested that Parliament was dysfunctional. And yet here we are. If things were so dysfunctional, there was an election, you have the same result as before. How are things going to be less dysfunctional in the Prime Minister's view? They're going to have to find a way to get legislation passed and to make Parliament work with the other parties.
Mm-hmm. John, any thoughts on that? Does the fact that the Liberals have another minority make it easier or harder for them to govern?
It's a very strange argument that Mr. Trudeau is making because, in fact, the government got its agenda through over the last 2 years. The big national childcare program is now entrenched and will go forward. The climate change program as well is entrenched and will go forward. And of course, yes, there were massive legislative actions to fight the pandemic, and there will be more to come, and Parliament will support those actions. So I don't know why the Liberals kept claiming that Parliament was toxic and nothing was getting done. The only reason anything didn't get passed in this last Parliament was because the Prime Minister pulled the plug and called an election.
If you think about this as a performance review of how the Liberals have handled the pandemic, what do you think the results tell us about how voters feel?
Well, I think the voters feel that the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party did just fine handling the pandemic overall, especially in support for workers and support for businesses on the economic side, and a bit late, but better late than never, procuring the necessary supplies of vaccine and producing what is one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. Those are all great accomplishments.
So there are a few wild cards in this election that we should talk about. So first of all, the Liberal NDP switchers, Kristy, you mentioned this earlier, Jagmeet Singh was really campaigning to form government, really making the case that people should not vote strategically for the Liberals and vote instead for the NDP. Were they able to make any significant gains in this election?
Yeah, I think that the NDP will point to be able to pick up, some support, and frankly, that Jagmeet Singh, was able to deliver a message that did resonate with people. I will say, just from the Liberal perspective as well, that over the last week or so on the campaign trail, Justin Trudeau has really cranked up the volume on trying to appeal to progressives, saying that, back in 2019, he was upset when experts were essentially suggesting, particularly on the climate piece, that the Greens and the NDP had more ambitious plans than the Liberals. And so he said they sought the advice of experts. They went out and they created what he calls the most ambitious and progressive plan. And so there was this attempt to really woo progressive voters in this election to not only stop the Conservatives from forming government, but to also say that essentially the Liberals will be, as Justin Trudeau describes it, the most progressive government in the history of this country. And I think for the NDP, if we're to anticipate what Jagmeet Singh will say, I think he will say they ran a positive, strong campaign, and that they are going to, again, work in collaboration and in partnership with the Liberals on the issues that matter to their supporters.
Though the NDP would have loved to have had a stronger result, and the NDP would have loved to have seen the Liberals weaken to the point where the Liberals could not govern without the support of the NDP. That probably is not as great an imperative with this Parliament as it would have been if the Liberals had been knocked down a few more seats.
John, so the other wild card in this election is the People's Party of Canada, Maxime Bernier's party. They only received 1.62% of the vote in 2019. Going into this election, they were polling at around 7%. And people were speculating that this could have an impact on the Conservatives. So did we end up seeing this reflected in actual votes? And what kind of impact did the PPC end up having on the Conservatives?
Well, there are people who are going to say the Conservatives could have won this riding or that riding if votes hadn't drained away to the PPC. But then who would have won this riding or that riding if votes hadn't drained from the Greens? It's really hard to say that all the PPC votes were Conservative votes that went over to them. There could have been people from all sorts of parties going over to the PPC vote. What matters, though, is that the vote isn't that substantial. The last time I looked, they still had not taken any seats. So the great populist, far right-wing, anti-vax, anti-climate change, anti-high levels of immigration party, that movement that Maxime Bernier was hoping to generate still is pretty much dead on arrival.
Okay, and then I also wanted to ask you about the Greens. Kristy, the Greens have been plagued for months by internal fighting. They went into this election running candidates in only 252 of Canada's 338 ridings. How did they do in this election?
Well, I think the Greens going into this campaign were having a lot of issues internally. There were a number of stories, particularly about their leader, Annamie Paul. I don't think that the Greens are going to be particularly pleased with the results that they're seeing. That being said, I guess things could have gone worse for the party, frankly, because I think going into this election, again, things were looking pretty dire, and there were repeated national news stories about essentially, this implosion and internal spat that was playing out amongst the Greens.
John, there were some really tight races in Quebec between the Bloc and the Liberals, and things got even more unpredictable after a controversial question during the English language debate that seemed to kind of give new life to the Bloc campaign. So can you tell me a bit about that and what kind of impact Quebec has had on this election?
Again, I think it's pretty much status quo ante. The Bloc was, I think, hoping to pick up some support and to erode the Liberal numbers in Quebec, especially after, ironically, the English language debate brought up the question of the preservation and protection of Quebec language and Quebec culture. But in the end, the Bloc is still there, but the Bloc is not dominant. We'll have to see, once the mail-in ballots arrive, just what the final disposition of seats is in Quebec. But I can't think that any party in Quebec feels great about the result. The Bloc is there, but not really any stronger. The Liberals didn't get their majority government by sweeping them away, and the Conservatives didn't have a very good night either.
Are there any surprising wins or losses that you think we should note? Kristy, maybe you go first.
I guess one that comes to mind, I don't know if it was surprising. It's a very competitive race, but we did see that cabinet minister lost her seat tonight. I'm talking about Miriam Monsef in a riding in Peterborough, Kawartha. Justin Trudeau had just gone to do a rally in her riding the other day, and when she was speaking to reporters after that event, she was pretty honest, saying, that it was going to be a competitive fight. This will be a loss in Justin Trudeau's cabinet.
John, I wonder if you can talk a bit about how things unfolded regionally this time around. In 2019, the big story coming out of the election was Western alienation. Are there any shifts that we've seen regionally this time that you think we should make a note of?
At the time of night that we're talking, we have a large number of ridings that we still are too close to call, so it would be premature. I think the one thing we can say is Atlantic Canada went against the tide in this election campaign. There was a cabinet minister defeated there as well, I believe. The Tories picked up a couple of seats in the region, and it looked as though if Atlantic Canada was to be a bellwether for the country, that the Conservatives were going to have a pretty good night. In the end, as it turned out, this has happened before, mind you, regional discontents over the fishery and other issues in Atlantic Canada worked to the Conservatives' advantage in that region, but they weren't able to translate into the big swaths of ridings in Ontario and Quebec and in the West.
So Elections Canada says that this election is going to cost us a total of $610 million. John, at the end of the day, do you think this was worth it?
Elections are always worth it to the extent that they reaffirm the robustness of our democracy, and Canadian democracy is very robust. But no, I think in all of the elections that I have covered over more than 30 years, I have never seen a bigger waste of time than this one. No one wanted it. The voters were angry that it had been called. They punished the Liberals by not giving them a majority government, but they weren't ready to hand the Conservatives power either. Or even to bump them up very much in the vote. The big swaths of suburban ridings surrounding Toronto and the Lower Mainland pretty much decided to keep the status quo. So I'm not going to say the election was a mistake or a waste of time, because as I say, when people go out and vote and express their will, that is never a waste of time. But in terms of actual outcomes, shaping the future of the country in ways that it would not have been shaped if we had just kept going for a couple of more years, it's hard to justify.
And Kristy, as you guys have said a number of times throughout our conversation, there's been a lot of anger directed at Justin Trudeau for calling this election. You're there right now with the Liberals. Do you think that his political gamble has paid off?
No, because I think that even though it was essentially a dirty word during the campaign, the Liberals were seeking a majority. That word did not come out of his lips, but it actually did come out of the mouth of a party stalwart and cabinet minister, Dominic LeBlanc, who at a campaign stop essentially suggested that a majority could be within reach. I think that, again, there are Liberals that are going to be very disappointed that the whole point of this exercise to get more seats, frankly, and to look at having the majority mandate they had in 2015, it just didn't come to fruition. And frankly, I think one of the things that surprised me most about covering this campaign is that Justin Trudeau has really never been able to get out from under that question of why did you call this election in the first place? If you're going to engage in this exercise, that's kind of the fundamental question. And I think perhaps, his team underestimated that this was going to be something that, didn't just last a day or two in the news cycle. This was something that, Canadians were talking about. And frankly, I don't know if this is a widespread thing, but it's certainly something that I've heard. I think that Canadians have a bit of a limited bandwidth right now because of the situation that we've been going through, and I'm talking about the pandemic for the last 18 months plus. People are tired. There's a fourth wave of the pandemic, particularly this fall, with parents having kids going back to school. People are really on edge, frankly, and worried about what the future holds, and having one more thing to think about and having a federal election and another choice that was put before them. To go back to your question, was it worth it? Well, this cost a lot of money and a lot of time for a lot of people, and yet we're essentially back to the drawing board again.
And Decibel listeners will be thrilled to hear that because we have a minority government and because the results were pretty much the same as the last time, leadership speculation and, yes, election speculation will be in the air with a matter of months.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much to you both. I really, really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you to John Ibbitson and Kristy Kirkup. You can find more of our election coverage at globeandmail.com. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. If you haven't already, hit that follow button wherever you're listening so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.